What would you do if your peaceful mountain retreat turned into the scene of a shocking crime, perpetrated by people you didn't even know existed? That's exactly what happened to me. A simple weekend getaway with my wife turned into a battle against a powerful HOA I wasn't even a part of. Let me tell you, it's a story filled with audacity, twists, and justice. My name is James Turner, and my wife, Sophia, and I own a cozy cabin tucked deep in the forests of Montana, near Gallatin National Forest. For years, it has been our sanctuary, a place to escape the noise of the city, breathe in fresh mountain air, and lose ourselves in nature. The cabin sits on 5 acres of land, bordered by the national forest, and the nearest neighbors are half a mile away, or so I thought. One crisp October evening, Sophia and I arrived at the cabin for a much-needed weekend retreat. As I turned into the gravel driveway, something unusual caught my eye: tire tracks leading off the path and disappearing into the trees on our land. "Do you see those tracks?" I asked Sophia, my brow furrowed. She leaned forward to get a better look. "Maybe someone got lost and had to turn around," she suggested, always the optimist. "Maybe," I muttered, though something about it didn't feel right. The land around our cabin was private, and we rarely had unexpected visitors. I made a mental note to investigate in the morning, determined to enjoy our quiet evening. That night, the crackling fireplace and the familiar scent of pine filled the air, helping me push the strange discovery out of my mind, at least temporarily. But when morning came, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a mug of coffee, slipped on my boots, and followed the tracks through the dense underbrush. What I found on the other side stopped me cold. Nestled in a small clearing was a brand new utility shed, complete with a heavy-duty padlock and a thick black cable running straight toward my cabin. I stepped closer, peering through a small window. Inside were breaker boxes, meters, and a setup that could only mean one thing: someone was siphoning electricity from my cabin. "Unbelievable," I muttered under my breath, my heart pounding. Who had the audacity to trespass on my land and steal from me? And why? The answer would lead me down a path I never expected, a battle not just for my property, but for my principles. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The next morning, the chill of the Montana air bit through my jacket as I followed the tire tracks deeper into the forest. With every step, unease settled heavier in my chest. The path was well trodden, as if someone had been using it regularly, on my land, without my knowledge. The tracks led to a small clearing, and there it was, a utility shed. It looked freshly built, the wood still bright and the paint unweathered. But what truly caught my attention was the thick black cable running from the shed, snaking its way directly toward my cabin. My heart raced as I stepped closer. Peeking through a narrow window, I saw breaker boxes, meters, and other electrical equipment. There was no mistaking it. Someone had tapped into my cabin's power supply. Anger bubbled to the surface as I tried to piece together the audacity of it all. Who would trespass on my land? Why would they need this setup? Questions swirled in my mind as I hurried back to the cabin, my boots crunching loudly on the frosty ground. "Sophia!" I called as I threw open the door. My wife was sitting by the fireplace, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. She looked up, startled by my tone. "What's wrong, James?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "You won't believe this," I said, pacing the room. "There's a utility shed in the woods. Someone's been stealing our electricity." Sophia's eyes widened in disbelief. "Stealing? But how? And who would do that?" "I don't know," I admitted, running a hand through my hair. "But it's there, meters, breakers, the works. And it's connected directly to our main line." The weight of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just a random trespasser wandering onto our property. This was deliberate, calculated theft. "Do you think it's someone local?" Sophia asked, standing now, her voice tinged with both curiosity and anger. I'm not sure, I replied. But I plan to find out. I grabbed my phone and dialed the sheriff's office in Helena. The deputy on the line seemed skeptical at first, but the urgency in my voice must have convinced him to take me seriously. He promised to send someone out to investigate. While we waited, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just stolen electricity. To distract myself, I decided to survey the rest of our property, hoping to find more clues. As I made my way along the edge of our land, I spotted something that made my stomach drop, a pristine white fence marking the boundary of what looked like a high-end residential development. Beyond the fence, I saw manicured lawns, a clubhouse, and even a tennis court. A polished sign read, Maple Ridge Estates, private property. Where did this come from? I whispered to myself. We hadn't been to the cabin in months, but surely we would have noticed the construction of an entire neighborhood. How had this upscale community sprung up so close to our land without us knowing? By the time I returned to the cabin, a sheriff's deputy had arrived and was examining the shed with Sophia. I quickly filled him in on what I discovered about Maple Ridge Estates. The deputy nodded knowingly. Yeah, they finished building that place about 6 months ago. It's one of those gated communities for the wealthy. High security, big amenities. Did they have any reason to be on my land? I asked, my frustration growing. The deputy shook his head. Not legally. If they tapped into your power, that's a serious crime. We'll get the power company involved to safely disconnect it, and we'll open an investigation. As the deputy spoke, Sophia walked out of the cabin, holding a stack of papers. James, she said, her voice tight, I just checked our electricity bills. They've tripled over the past 6 months. The realization hit like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a small theft, it was calculated, organized, and expensive. Someone had been stealing from us, not just financially, but also violating the sanctity of our peaceful retreat. And now, I had a strong suspicion where this trail of theft was leading, straight to the gates of Maple Ridge Estates. As the chill of the day deepened, my resolve hardened. The illegal connection wasn't just a nuisance, it was a direct assault on our home, our privacy, and our peace of mind. Standing in the middle of the forest with the sheriff and Sophia by my side, I knew we had to act swiftly. The deputy, after examining the shed, pulled out a notepad and started jotting down notes. This setup is definitely illegal, he said, tapping his pen against the padlock on the door. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. It's not easy to tap into a main line without risking electrocution. I crossed my arms, the anger simmering just below the surface. So what happens now? Do you have any idea who's responsible? He nodded toward the pristine white fence visible through the trees. If I were a betting man, I'd say it's someone from Maple Ridge Estates. That development just went up a few months ago, and they're using a ton of electricity for those amenities. We'll start there. The deputy called the power company, who promised to send a crew immediately to disconnect the illegal connection. In the meantime, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I'm going to that community, I told Sophia. I need answers. Sophia grabbed my arm, her expression both supportive and concerned. James, be careful. If they're bold enough to do this, who knows what else they're capable of. The drive to Maple Ridge Estates was short, but my mind raced the entire way. Questions tumbled over each other. Who authorized this? How could they think they'd get away with it? And, most importantly, why did they target us? Arriving at the gated entrance, I was greeted by a uniformed security guard. His expression was carefully neutral as he approached my truck. Can I help you? He asked, though his tone suggested he didn't think I belonged there. Yeah, you can, I replied, stepping out of the vehicle. I own the cabin down the hill. Someone from this community has been stealing electricity from my property, and I need to speak to whoever's in charge. The guard hesitated for a moment, then lifted a walkie-talkie to his mouth. Let me see if the HOA president is available. I paced by my truck as the minutes ticked by, each second stoking the fire of my frustration. Finally, a sleek black SUV rolled up, and a well-dressed man in his 50s stepped out. His smile was as polished as his shoes, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good afternoon," he said smoothly, extending a hand. "I'm Richard Caldwell, president of the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association. What seems to be the issue?" I ignored his outstretched hand. "The issue," I began, my voice steady but firm, "is that someone from your community built a shed on my land and tapped into my electricity. That's theft, and I want answers." Caldwell's smile never wavered. My, he said with a slight chuckle, "there must be some kind of misunderstanding. Why don't you come up to the clubhouse? We can discuss this like civilized people." Reluctantly, I followed him through the gates, my fists clenched at my sides. The clubhouse was every bit as luxurious as I expected, wood-paneled walls, leather furniture, and an air of exclusivity. Caldwell gestured for me to sit in a plush chair across from his massive desk. "Now then," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I assure you, Maple Ridge Estates would never engage in anything illegal. This must be a mix-up with the power company." I shook my head, my voice rising. "There's no mix-up. The sheriff and the power company have already confirmed the illegal connection. It's on my land, and it's feeding into your community." For the first time, Caldwell's smile faltered. He cleared his throat, then leaned forward. "Well, if there has been any oversight, I'm sure we can come to an amicable solution. Perhaps we could arrange a rental agreement for the use of your land." I stared at him, disbelief mingling with fury. "A rental agreement? You stole thousands of dollars of electricity from me. I don't want an agreement, I want justice. And I want that shed off my property immediately." Caldwell's demeanor shifted. The charming smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, calculating gaze. "Listen, Mr. Turner," he said, his voice low and sharp, "Maple Ridge Estates is an influential community. Many of our residents hold significant positions in this county. It would be in your best interest to work with us." I stood, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Caldwell? Because I can assure you, that's not going to work. I'll see you in court." With that, I stormed out, my anger boiling over as I walked back to my truck. Sophia was right, these people weren't just stealing electricity. They were stealing peace of mind, and they thought they could get away with it. But they were about to learn just how wrong they were. When we arrived back at the cabin, the audacity of Richard Caldwell's veiled threats weighed heavily on me. His polished charm masked a deeper menace, one that he seemed to think would intimidate me into compliance. But if he believed I would roll over and let him and his HOA trample my rights, he was in for a rude awakening. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Sophia and I sat at the kitchen table, poring over documents. Our electricity bills told a story of escalating theft, month after month of unexplained spikes that aligned perfectly with the completion of Maple Ridge Estates. "This isn't just theft, James," Sophia said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. "It's premeditated. They've been stealing from us since they moved in. Thousands of dollars, just gone." Her words hit me like a punch. This wasn't a simple mistake. This was a calculated crime. My resolve hardened as I reached for my phone and called our lawyer in Bozeman. "We're filing a lawsuit," I said firmly. "Theft of utilities, trespassing, property damage, everything." The lawyer, a seasoned professional with a reputation for standing up to powerful entities, assured us she would handle it. But even as she began drafting the paperwork, I couldn't shake the feeling that Caldwell and his HOA wouldn't back down without a fight. 2 days later, a letter arrived at the cabin. The HOA had filed a countersuit. Their claim? That they held a legitimate easement agreement allowing them access to our land. The document they provided was dated years before we'd purchased the property, allegedly signed by the previous owner. But there was one glaring problem: it was a complete fabrication. I slammed the letter onto the table, my frustration boiling over. They're forging documents now? How far are they willing to go? Sophia picked up the paper, her eyes scanning the details. This isn't just dishonest. It's desperate, she said. They know they're in the wrong, and they're trying to bury us in legal red tape. The next morning, our lawyer called with more troubling news. James, you need to be prepared, she warned. This HOA has resources, and they're not afraid to use them. Their goal is to outlast you, financially and emotionally. But we have a strong case, and I won't let them intimidate us. Her words were reassuring, but they didn't stop the mounting tension. That night, as I worked on some repairs in the cabin, headlights pierced through the darkness outside. Peering out the window, I saw a sleek black SUV idling at the edge of our driveway. Two large men in suits stepped out, their figures silhouetted against the high beams. My heart raced as they approached the cabin. A loud knock echoed through the door. Mr. Turner, one of them called out, his voice gruff and commanding. We represent Maple Ridge Estates. We'd like to have a word. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I grabbed my phone. I have nothing to say to you, I shouted through the door. Leave my property now, or I'm calling the sheriff. For a moment, there was only silence. Then I heard the men muttering to each other before the heavy footsteps retreated. I watched through the window as the SUV backed down the driveway and disappeared into the night. Sophia returned to the cabin shortly after, and I filled her in on what had happened. Her face paled, but her determination didn't waver. They're trying to scare us, she said. But we won't let them. The next day, our lawyer suggested we install security cameras around the property. It was a precaution I hadn't thought we'd need, but now, it seemed essential. As I mounted the cameras along the cabin's perimeter, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what we were up against. This wasn't just about stolen electricity anymore. It was about power, intimidation, and a battle of wills. The fight with Maple Ridge Estates HOA had only just begun, but one thing was clear: they'd underestimated me. And they'd underestimated Sophia. Together, we weren't just defending our property, we were defending our right to live free from the overreach of those who thought they could take whatever they wanted. This was far from over. The fight had escalated into a full-blown legal war, and every step forward seemed to come with a new, gut-punching twist. With our lawyer from Bozeman leading the charge, Sophia and I filed a lawsuit against Maple Ridge Estates HOA, accusing them of theft of utilities, trespassing, and property damage. It felt empowering to take action, but we quickly learned that going up against a powerful, well-funded HOA wasn't going to be easy. Barely a week after we filed, the countersuit from Maple Ridge Estates landed on our doorstep. Their claim? That they held a legitimate easement agreement granting them access to the area where the utility shed stood. They even presented what appeared to be a signed document from the previous owner of our property, dated years before we'd purchased the cabin. I stared at the paper in disbelief. The signature, the notary stamp, everything looked legitimate. But I knew it was a lie. There was no mention of any easement agreement in our deed, and we'd thoroughly reviewed the property's records when we bought it. This is insane, I muttered, slamming the paper onto the table. They're forging documents now. Sophia picked it up, scanning the details with a sharp eye. It's not just dishonest, she said, her voice tight. It's calculated. They're trying to bury us in red tape and make us give up. Our lawyer wasn't fazed. This isn't unusual for cases like this, she said during our next meeting. HOAs like Maple Ridge think they can bully people into submission. But this document doesn't hold up under scrutiny, and we're going to prove it. As the weeks passed, the intimidation tactics from the HOA only grew bolder. Anonymous letters began arriving at the cabin, each one more threatening than the last. They warned us to drop the lawsuit or face the consequences. Phone calls came at all hours, the voices on the other end dripping with menace. One even warned, "You don't know who you're messing with." One evening, while Sophia was out running errands, I heard a vehicle approach the cabin. My stomach tightened as I peeked out the window to see the same black SUV that had shown up before. Two men in suits stepped out, their movements deliberate, almost rehearsed. "Mr. Turner," one of them called, knocking heavily on the door. "We strongly suggest you reconsider your actions. This lawsuit won't end well for you." Adrenaline surged through me as I grabbed my phone and hit record. "Leave my property now," I shouted, "or the sheriff will be here in minutes." They hesitated, exchanging a glance before retreating. Watching them drive away, I felt a mix of fear and anger. They're trying to scare us, I thought, clenching my fists. But if anything, their tactics only strengthened my resolve. The turning point came when our lawyer tracked down a critical witness, Thomas Grayson, a contractor who had worked on Maple Ridge Estates. Initially hesitant to speak out, Thomas admitted under questioning that Richard Caldwell, the HOA president, had personally instructed him to tap into our power line. He knew it was illegal, Thomas confessed, his voice tinged with regret. But he told me not to worry. He said he'd take care of it if anyone found out. Thomas's testimony was a bombshell. It painted a picture of a premeditated operation, orchestrated by Caldwell himself. Armed with this new evidence, our lawyer moved swiftly to file additional charges against the HOA and demand a court date. As the day of the trial approached, Sophia and I felt the weight of the battle pressing down on us. We were up against a powerful organization that seemed willing to go to any lengths to win. But we also had the truth on our side, and now, we had proof. Sophia placed her hand over mine one evening as we sat reviewing the mountain of documents our lawyer had prepared. "We're doing the right thing," she said softly. "No matter how hard they push, we have to stand our ground." Her words gave me strength. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about standing up to those who believed their power made them untouchable. We had come too far to back down now. The courtroom showdown was looming, and I was ready to fight for everything we had worked so hard to protect. The day of the trial arrived, and the courthouse in Helena was abuzz with tension. It seemed like everyone in the county had turned out to watch the spectacle of Turner versus Maple Ridge Estates HOA. The courtroom was packed, residents from Maple Ridge, locals curious about the case, and reporters eager for a story. As Sophia and I took our seats at the plaintiff's table, I felt the weight of dozens of eyes on us. This wasn't just our fight anymore. It felt like a battle for every individual who had ever been bullied by those with power and influence. Our lawyer began with a meticulous presentation of evidence. She displayed photographs of the illegal utility shed, the inflated electricity bills we had endured for months, and most damning of all, the testimony of Thomas Grayson, the contractor who had installed the illegal connection. "Mr. Grayson," our lawyer asked, "who instructed you to tap into the Turner family's power supply?" Grayson, visibly nervous but resolute, glanced toward the defense table before answering. "It was Richard Caldwell. He knew it was illegal, but he said he'd handle any problems if they came up." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Sophia gripped my hand tightly, her nails digging into my palm. I could feel the tremble in her fingers, anger, relief, and vindication all rolled into one. When it was time for the HOA's defense, their lawyer attempted to frame the situation as a misunderstanding. They waved around the forged easement document, trying to convince the court that their actions were within legal bounds. But their arguments were weak, and the cracks in their story were obvious to everyone in the room. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. Richard Caldwell himself took the stand. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his polished exterior a stark contrast to the venomous man I had faced in his office. His arrogance was palpable as he answered questions, his tone clipped and dismissive. But our lawyer was relentless. Her questions were sharp, and her evidence was airtight. Caldwell squirmed under the pressure, his confidence visibly cracking. "Mr. Caldwell," she asked, her voice cutting through the courtroom, "did you or did you not instruct Mr. Grayson to tap into the Turner family's power supply?" His face flushed. He shifted in his seat, his lips pressing into a thin line. He began, but then his temper got the better of him. "Fine," he snapped, his voice rising. "Yes, we took their power. We needed it for the community amenities. Who cares if we borrowed a little juice from some cabin dwellers?" The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Caldwell had just confessed, openly, arrogantly, and without remorse. The judge's ruling came swiftly. Maple Ridge Estates HOA was found guilty on all counts: theft of utilities, trespassing, and property damage. They were ordered to pay $50,000 in damages to Sophia and me. Caldwell himself was charged with felony theft and perjury, facing 18 months in prison. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, I felt a rush of emotions so powerful it left me momentarily speechless. Relief, vindication, and a quiet, simmering rage at the audacity of Caldwell and his HOA. I turned to Sophia, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We stood our ground, and we won." As we walked out of the courthouse, reporters swarmed us, their cameras flashing, their voices blending into a cacophony of questions. One of them asked, "How does it feel to take down such a powerful organization?" I paused, gripping Sophia's hand tightly. "We're glad justice was served," I said, my voice firm but measured. "No one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, has the right to trample on others. This victory isn't just for us, it's for everyone who's ever been wronged." That night, back at the cabin, we sat by the fireplace, the crackling flames casting warm shadows on the walls. The weight of the battle was finally lifting, leaving behind a mix of exhaustion and quiet pride. "Do you think they'll ever understand what they've done?" I asked Sophia, my voice low. She reached over, placing her hand on mine. "Maybe not," she said softly. "But what matters is that we fought for what was right. And we won, not just for us, but for anyone who's ever been silenced by people like Caldwell." Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked around the cabin, the place that had been our sanctuary, nearly stolen from us by greed and arrogance. It felt like we had reclaimed more than just electricity or money. We had reclaimed our peace, our dignity, and our belief in standing up for what's right. And as we sat there, watching the flames dance, I felt something I hadn't in months: hope. The aftermath of the trial was nothing short of a reckoning for Maple Ridge Estates HOA. News of their corruption spread like wildfire, making headlines in local newspapers and even sparking heated discussions on social media. For a community that had prided itself on exclusivity and prestige, the revelations were devastating. Their once pristine reputation lay in tatters, and the cracks in their gilded facade began to show. Within weeks, the effects of the trial became painfully evident. Residents, many of whom had blindly trusted their HOA to manage their neighborhood, now faced the harsh reality of the organization's deceit. The luxurious amenities, gleaming tennis courts, the sparkling community pool, and the grand clubhouse, quickly fell into disrepair. Without the funds to maintain them, they became symbols of a community brought low by its own hubris. Some homeowners, disgusted by the scandal, put their properties up for sale. For others, the plummeting property values made escape impossible. "This place was supposed to be an investment," one resident lamented to a local reporter. "Now it's a liability." A few months after the trial, the remaining board members of the HOA resigned under pressure from residents. With no leadership and no funds, Maple Ridge Estates HOA was formally dissolved. The once powerful organization, which had wielded so much control, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. Sophia and I heard about the dissolution through our lawyer, who called with the update. It's poetic justice, she said with a hint of satisfaction. They tried to intimidate you, and now they're the ones who've been dismantled. I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions, relief, vindication, and even a touch of sorrow for the residents who had been caught in the crossfire. But more than anything, I felt a deep sense of closure. Back at our cabin, life slowly returned to normal, though it would never quite be the same. Sophia and I used part of the settlement money to install a state-of-the-art security system, complete with cameras covering every inch of our property. But the most meaningful change came in the form of a grove of aspen trees we planted where the illegal utility shed once stood. As we dug holes for the saplings, the crisp Montana air filling our lungs, Sophia paused and wiped a tear from her cheek. "This feels like a fresh start," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's not just about winning the case. It's about reclaiming what's ours." Her words stayed with me as I looked at the slender trees, their leaves quivering in the breeze. They were more than just trees, they were a living reminder of our fight, our perseverance, and the power of standing up for what's right. Our victory sparked more than just the downfall of Maple Ridge Estates HOA. It inspired a broader conversation in the county about the unchecked power of homeowner associations. Other communities began scrutinizing their HOAs, uncovering instances of financial mismanagement, unfair practices, and even discriminatory policies. The county eventually formed a task force to oversee HOA operations, ensuring transparency and fairness. Sophia and I were invited to speak at the task force's inaugural meeting. Standing before the crowd, I felt a mix of pride and humility. "We never set out to be trailblazers," I said, my voice steady but full of emotion. "We just wanted to protect what was ours. But if our story can help others, then everything we went through was worth it." Late one evening, as Sophia and I sat by the fireplace, she looked over at me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said softly, "as awful as this experience was, I'm almost grateful for it. It showed us how strong we can be, and it made this place feel even more like home." I nodded, her words settling over me like a warm blanket. She was right. The cabin, once just a peaceful retreat, had become a symbol of resilience, of everything we had fought for and won. As the fire crackled and the shadows danced on the walls, I felt a deep sense of peace. The fight was over, but its impact would linger, in the grove of aspens, in the lessons we had learned, and in the knowledge that even the smallest voices can bring down the most towering forces. 5 years had passed since the trial, and life at the cabin had finally settled into the quiet rhythm Sophia and I had always envisioned. The aspen trees we planted stood tall now, their leaves whispering in the mountain breeze, a living testament to the battle we had fought and won. Yet, one crisp autumn morning, a letter arrived that threatened to stir up old wounds. The return address caught my eye immediately, Richard Caldwell. I hesitated before opening it, my mind racing with possibilities. What could the man who had tried to ruin us possibly have to say? Inside was a handwritten note, its tone surprisingly humble. Caldwell was out of prison and wanted to meet, to apologize, he claimed. Sophia read the letter over my shoulder, her brow furrowing. "Do you think he's sincere?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. "I don't know," I admitted, my stomach churning. "But after everything he's done, I'm not sure I care." Sophia placed a hand on mine, her touch grounding me. "Maybe it's not about him. Maybe it's about us. Closure can be a powerful thing, James." Reluctantly, I agreed. We arranged to meet at a small coffee shop in Helena, a neutral place where the ghosts of the past would feel less suffocating. When Caldwell walked through the door, I almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the impeccably dressed man with the polished smile and the air of invincibility. In his place stood someone smaller, wearier, and visibly aged. His once expensive clothes now hung awkwardly on his thinner frame, and his hair was streaked with gray. He approached our table cautiously, his hands trembling slightly as he extended one toward me. "Mr. Turner." "Mrs. Turner," he said quietly. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Sophia nodded politely, but I said nothing, keeping my arms crossed. The anger I thought I had buried years ago threatened to resurface, but I forced myself to listen. Caldwell sat down, his eyes darting between us before settling on the table. "I owe you both an apology," he began, his voice cracking. "What we did, was inexcusable. I let greed and arrogance blind me to what was right. And I paid the price for it." He spoke about his time in prison, the loneliness, and the realization of how far he had fallen. His wife had divorced him, and his children refused to speak to him. "I lost everything," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "My wealth, my reputation, even my family. But most of all, I lost myself." For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity for him, but it was quickly drowned out by memories of the pain he had caused us. Sophia, however, leaned forward slightly, her expression softening. "Why reach out now?" she asked. "Why after all this time?" Caldwell took a deep breath. "Because I needed to face you. To tell you that your fight, what you did, changed me. In prison, I had to confront the man I'd become. I was selfish, entitled, and thought I was untouchable. But your stand against me forced me to see the truth." He slid an envelope across the table. "This isn't much," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I wanted to offer some restitution. I know it won't undo the harm I caused, but I hope it's a step toward making amends." Inside was a cashier's check for $10,000. Sophia and I exchanged a look, her eyes filled with the same mix of surprise and skepticism I felt. "You don't have to do this," I said, my voice tight. "It won't change what happened." "I know," Caldwell replied. "But I want to. Not for forgiveness, because I don't deserve it, but to try and start making things right." As we left the coffee shop, I felt an unexpected lightness in my chest. I wasn't ready to forgive Caldwell, and maybe I never would. But seeing the broken man he had become, I realized something: justice had been served. The arrogance that once defined him was gone, replaced by humility and regret. "Do you think he's really changed?" Sophia asked as we walked to the car. "I think he's trying," I said after a pause. "And maybe that's enough." Later that evening, we sat by the fireplace, the envelope still unopened on the table between us. Sophia broke the silence. "What should we do with it?" After a moment of thought, I replied, "Let's donate it. To something good. Something that helps others the way we were helped." She smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "That sounds right." As the fire crackled and the cabin filled with warmth, I realized that the meeting with Caldwell hadn't been about reopening old wounds. It had been about closing them. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace, not just for what we had endured, but for the person I had become because of it. As the years passed, the scars of our battle faded, leaving behind lessons we would carry forever. The cabin, once just a retreat from the chaos of city life, had become so much more. It was a symbol of resilience, of standing firm in the face of injustice, and of reclaiming what mattered most: peace, dignity, and the belief that even the smallest voices could make a difference. The aspen grove we planted flourished, its leaves rustling gently in the mountain breeze. Every time I looked at those trees, I felt a swell of pride, not just for the fight we had won, but for the strength Sophia and I found in each other through it all. The cabin had become more than a home, it was a reminder of how far we had come. We also found unexpected allies in some of the remaining residents of Maple Ridge Estates. Without the rigid rules and power-hungry board members, the community softened. A few families reached out, and over time, we built friendships. They shared hiking trails we hadn't explored and joined us for summer barbecues. The past couldn't be erased, but it had paved the way for something better, a closer, more understanding community. One evening, as Sophia and I sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the mountains, she turned to me with a reflective smile. "You know," she said, "this place means more to me now than it ever did before. It's not just a cabin, it's proof that standing up for what's right is always worth it." I raised my glass to hers, clinking softly in the fading light. "To many more peaceful sunsets," I said, my voice steady with gratitude. Sophia laughed, her voice ringing out like music. "And to no more surprise electric bills." We sat in comfortable silence, the cool evening air wrapping around us like an old friend. The fireflies danced in the distance, and the aspen swayed gently, a living, breathing reminder of the power of perseverance. Have you ever felt powerless against a homeowners association, a bossy neighbor, or even a Karen? How did you handle it? Or are you still searching for a way to fight back? Share your story below, we'd love to hear how you stood up for what's right. Let's create a space for others to feel empowered and supported.